I'm a little confused between storytelling and an elevator pitch. How are they different? What should be part of an elevator pitch?
So I think they're more of a compliment, right? I think you've got to think of storytelling, right? We always hear about good storytelling and ethical storytelling really draws in somebody by sharing, an emotional connection, something that emotionally connects someone to your cause, whatever story that is. That could be your donor hero story, that could be your, client you serve that has gone, started off here and ended up here and is doing so much better. And that was thanks to that person's own, fortitude and strength to get there. So like the client hero stories. So there's a lot of different types of stories out there, but, stories oftentimes, and they come in all different forms as we've seen, right? There's so many ways to communicate a story. And an elevator pitch I always think of as more like storytelling, right? Like you might see it on social media, video, websites, whatever, like all digital or like just, narrative storytelling. But then elevator pitch, you don't see that like necessarily, you would never see that on a video or like you don't see that as much. Like it's a very concrete, like small chunk of time, like an elevator ride, right? Like in an elevator ride, like that's where that came from. Like how long, how can I do something in that moment of time, that 30 or 60 seconds to hook you? Like it's about the hook, right? How am I going to hook you? Now, that's where I think those two can kind of complement each other. Like a quick story can hook a donor, but then like it's ultimately like, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get the donor to either do something, come tour the site. There's some question. It's like an elevator question, not an elevator pitch. And so like at the end of it, where am I trying to get the person I'm talking to and communicating with? Where am I trying to get them to go? And so those two can, I think, integrate really well. Sort of like a little mini story as part of the elevator pitch. So I see them differently, definitely like storytelling, and you see long storytelling form and short, whereas elevator pitch, the idea behind it is how do I grab your attention fairly quickly, right? But together, I think there's like a powerful narrative that can happen because none of us, I mean, Andy, you know how this is, like nobody wants to just have someone like do this quick pitch. Like it's not going to work. Like, okay, so you're like right? You're the used car salesman. No offense to any of those that might be listening. I'm sure they're not listening to our podcast, but anyway, right? But like, you don't want to be like that. So it's sort of like this narrative, like how do I communicate my nonprofit's value, my mission to you in a way that intrigues you enough to kind of move forward. And I do think stories like are one gateway to that, but it has to be a really like mini story. Like you're not going to go on for what might be a longer form story in an elevator pitch. And so I think the two work together, but an elevator pitch, right, is just like the brass tacks, like whereas storytelling, like elevator pitch, I'm like, I want to know like kind of what you do, what you're trying to solve, what problem you're trying to solve, and how I can help. Whereas a story oftentimes is just truly a standalone, like here's the emotional connection to our work. And so the two absolutely like need to be integrated. And that's where I think a pitch deck, right? Like you think about traditional pitch decks have, here's our slides on our mission, here's our slides on our impact and our financials. Here's some challenges and solutions, but like, I think that's where you can also incorporate like the story into your pitch deck, like, and that's where that kind of goes. But elevator pitch, standalone, short, sweet. Let me get you to take the next step. Like, is the whole key of it.
I think I understand the difference, but when do you use an elevator pitch? Like, clearly not in an elevator. That would get you some side eye, right? But what
it would be really creepy.
What's that for? Is that like you're trapped on an airplane and somebody goes, hey, what do you do? And then you're like, okay, I guess I get to use my elevator pitch, right? Because this person literally cannot leave because the seatbelt sign's on. Like when are you actually supposed to use it?
I mean, I see elevator pitches being whenever you're in sort of a setting that networking is like the biggest area, right? Like, so whether you're in a networking event, or even you're at like a family or a friend function, at some reunion, whatever. Like reunions are on my mind because oh dear Lord, 30 years. I can't believe I'm saying that. 30-year high school reunion is coming up. In another month or two. And so I was thinking like if I choose to go to that reunion, there's a perfect opportunity where people are like, hey, what are you up to? Or what are you doing? Like, and if I was, let's say one of the boards I serve on, like Wagging Tails rescue dogs, right? Like I might be like, hey, like my day job is this, but like what I'm really passionate about is this rescue. And we got our two like, dog rescues from here, and then like a one or two, like something quick, right? Because they're not gonna like want. So it's sort of I think pitch. I don't like the idea of pitch because it feels like it's making a hard ask. It's really about how do I continue the conversation is the way like I think good quote elevator pitches are done, right? So how do I continue the conversation? How do I say enough where I'm like, hey, like, yeah, yeah. And if they seem interested, right? Like, I'd love to bring you, like, what about you? Do you have animals? Like, it's sort of like this quick, like, hey, here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm passionate about it. Like, here's what it's all about. And then like bringing it back to them because it can't be that one way thing. And so then they respond, yeah, I have pets and I love them. And hey, like, well, you should come. We have an upcoming event. Or hey, like at some point, if you ever want to learn more, like, let me show you whatever the shelter, or let me show you one of our foster homes or whatever. Like it's that next step piece. And so I think networking functions are a great way because we all are like, what do we say? And we get the boring, like, what do you do, Andy? Right? Like, what do you do? And it's sort of like, then someone says, oh, I am a, chief compliance officer. I'm a CPA. I'm a whatever, like fill in the blank. And it's like, okay, that doesn't like spark any more conversation. It's like, where do you go from there? Oh, like, so instead it's kind of how do I intrigue you enough with this quote pitch to like get you to continue the conversation? Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah. So
I think networking is the biggest thing, right? Like it's kind of networking opportunities.
Yeah. And just like when it comes up, right? It's just something that you want to have. Sounds like what you're saying is it's something that you want to have ready so that when someone asks, you've got something concise that doesn't ramble and go on for a long time. And isn't necessarily a story. It's more of a factual information with a hook at the end.
Yeah, it is. And that's where I think it could be integrated well, because I do think, again, people respond, right? The stats out there show it's something like people remember stories 22 times more than facts. So it's sort of like this opportunity to marry the two is the way I see it done the best, right? Like, so let me just tell you a quick, like, hey, well, what I'm passionate about is this dog rescue I serve on the board of. And, we got my husband and I got our two dogs from there. And like just the other day, like quick story, right? This happened. And like, I'm sure like, hey, how about you? Do you have animal? Like, and then it like just goes into, so it's kind of just, I feel like it's very fluid and organic when it happens well. I think you hear like a lot of times nonprofits say, let me train my board to do our elevator pitch. And I kind of want to cringe because I think unless they're doing it right, it becomes this little like recited mission statement, which again is the same as like telling someone what you do for a living. Like it bores, it doesn't connect. It doesn't invite someone to come in, right?
Yeah. So this poor Boy Scout standing out in front of a supermarket selling Camporama tickets. You're like, like you just good job on the memorizing. No, I don't want one.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Shurick. I'm here with my pal, Stacey Wedding, and we're here to answer questions about nonprofit stuff. So the way this works is you email us questions, you send it to us through the socials, you buttonhole us in the hallway, and say, hey, we've got a nonprofit question, and Stacey and I will do our absolute best to try to get an answer for you. And if we can't do it ourselves, and that happens quite often, we will go drag a guest expert in and get a guest expert to help us do it as well. So remember to send those questions in. We got a pretty good show for you today. Thank you for joining us. And we got a lot packed in, so we'll just jump right in. We're about to celebrate the 25th anniversary of our organization and are considering launching a recognition wall to shine a light on people who have a large impact on our nonprofit through non-financial means. For example, longtime employees, volunteers, certain board members, etc. Do you have any suggestions on selection criteria we should consider for inclusion in the wall?
I'm intrigued by this question because how many times, Andy, do you hear about a recognition wall or like some kind of wall like this that is always to do with financial like support, right? It's always monetary funding support. I don't know if I've seen a wall that hasn't been that before.
I don't know that I have either. I think this is a new thing I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, like I was intrigued. So anyways, kudos to like the organization because I love the fact, I do want to say this, right? Like sometimes I think people I'm going to answer the question, I promise, but I do have to go off on a little tailspin here. So like, I do think sometimes we get so focused on just the money and the people bringing us the money, and we lose sight of really other key, like important people in our organization who helped bring us to where we're at. And so like, kudos to you for realizing that. That's awesome. I think a couple of things you do need to answer before you even start to set criteria. Like, I think you need to say, is this like a snapshot in time? Like, is it, or like, is this looking at over the entire 25 years? Does this get added to in future years? I mean, maybe it is just a moment in time, but I think you need to think about, like, what is the timeline around this? Like, and do you have enough history and context from the past, like if it was 25 years ago, to be able to truly to know like who along the way helped shape the organization, and if do you have contacts you can go out to? So I mean, I think a couple of like some basic criteria I would look at would be length of service, right? Is there some sort of minimum threshold that you want to say as one of the criteria that you might like look at for this, right? Showing kind of that long-term commitment to your organization. I think that might be one thing worth noting. Were there like key like milestones in your history, right? Where there was some sort of like strategic initiative or some new program or something that without this person's leadership or without this person's, kind of like just advocating for this, it wouldn't have happened. And so I think that kind of leads to thinking about informal leadership. So I oftentimes think that so often with something like this, we might go right back to who was our founder. And yeah, the founder should absolutely probably be a part of this, but who else like was informal leaders who were role models, who were mentors to others, who influenced others. So maybe you look at like this informal leadership piece as well as a potential criteria. And one of the things that I oftentimes have talked with organizations about related to like when they say about who should like, we want to figure out board emeritus criteria. What should that be? Like one of the things I always say is like, did someone go above and beyond the call of duty, right? Like you have your basic responsibility, but was there someone who kind of always went above and beyond, like took the call and then did times 10, right? Like, and those people, it's hard to like quantify it, but are those people out there? And so some of what you're probably hearing my criteria, I think some of this is hard because it's going to be subjective, right? Like there's not going to be always like hey, you were here this many years. We could create this nice, neat criteria box to check off and say like, you were here. Like, it's not going to be like that. And so I think that you might look at this as an opportunity to actually, you could have a brainstorm or a committee, but you could also have this be something that you like, I don't know, I don't want to say a survey because surveys are so, but like, like something where you just sort of have, hey, submit, here's a handful of categories. We're looking for names that you think really made a difference, like informal leadership, like advocacy and ambassadorship. How many connections did someone make for us, helping us get to like this new milestone or reach this, like push us through from start to finish on like a goal or a new initiative. Like, I think you could create some fun and have employees, have your own volunteers, almost like nominate others because they might come up with ideas you don't know. Like, I think that would be kind of cool. And then if you could kind of have like whoever gets the most whatever nods or suggestions, like that kind of becomes part of your wall, or maybe they all do. Like, so I think the part that I like get nervous about with this question, and it's because what I would hate to see is you exclude anyone who really like should have been on there, right? And it's easy to have that happen, and then you like lose that relationship or you damage that relationship. And so I guess the other question to it might be, beyond this structure, is there a way to just highlight people who've made a difference instead of making it this like formal recognition wall, right? Like maybe it's instead like, we want to share the stories of people who have impacted us in different ways over the course of our 25 years. Like that might be more powerful. I don't know. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, I think your last point was the one that has me concerned, because the question asks about selection criteria, which means that we want to include some people and not include some people, which means the question asker is probably having a challenge trying to decide where to draw the line. So they want to have like a formal, like, well, if you did this or you were here for this long, you get to have it. But I think I like your idea of having nominating where it's less about like, these are all the people that had some sort of, like this is the 25th anniversary. These are all the people that had a large impact. And instead, like, pick and choose some stories about like, here's something that we loved that helped us grow. And here's a story about this one person that was involved in that thing. So that it's less criteria based and more narrative based, because then I don't think people are going to be left out, because then it's not like, well, if you were here for 20 years, you get on there, but if you were for 19 years, suck it. So there's got to be some, like, having a hard line is going to automatically make people upset. So if you made it more narrative based and made it more like of a nominating, I mean, you still have there's still the risk that you're going to forget somebody who's going to have their feelings hurt, but at least it isn't arbitrary. I mean, it's more just like, and I don't know, that I love the idea. I really do like the idea. And I like that it's, that you're recognizing people for more than just financial donations. And, we usually see this in like, oh, this is a guy that volunteered for us for 20 years, so we're going to name the volunteer room after him or something, somebody like that, where they get like a permanent, like the name is attached to something, or we're going to call it this thing that isn't necessarily because they gave us a bunch of money. We see that all the time. So yeah, I don't know. I feel your pain on this one about like, we don't want to mess it up because we're going to make people mad. That would be my fear would be that, for sure.
I like your idea though about, how can you marry the two? Like, do nominations as well as sort of sprinkling the stories or narratives. And here's the thing. What's the worst that happens? So you create whatever your nomination process or your criteria or whatever direction you decide to go, and you figure it out, you vet it, you put the names up, and you find out you forgot someone. I mean, obviously that doesn't feel good, but you could add them, right? Like, I mean, you could say, I am so sorry. Like, we have been kind of nose to the ground, and that is so embarrassing. I mean, you don't want to be in that spot, but I also don't think this is like like you're forever. I think someone would understand, right?
Yeah, I guess. And then, you inevitably have that one employee who's really bummed out. Like, well, I showed up on a Saturday once.
I know.
Well, that just doesn't meet that doesn't meet our standard. So it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to make somebody mad.
Yeah.
Stacey, how can I get my board to ask more questions and not rubber stamp everything?
Through good leadership and good agendas. How did you like that definitive answer?
I like that definitive answer.
Yeah, I was just like, no, I truly mean it. I think the way we structure agendas, particularly at board meetings, lead to this, right? Like, oh, we have this minuscule, like, here's 3 minutes, or this is an action item. It's not open for, we're not opening it up to discussion. We're not having, there's piece of this that's just the way an agenda is created, and also not allowing time for discussion on like strategic key questions. And I'm always a little bit surprised. When I talk about this idea with some of the organizations I work with, I always get, well, what would those questions be? And I'm like, gosh, like there's a million out there of like thinking strategically about not only your own organization, but just what are we seeing around us? What are we seeing in the landscape around us that we should be looking at? Like, why are we like, so I think some of this is about like, how do we offer, and sometimes it's just a discussion to just kind of help inform the work. And sometimes it should be a vote, but I think one of the ways, so beyond the agenda, I also think one of the ways is however the board chair leading the meeting, and the executive director can help influence this. So that's why I kind of look at this as like a partnership, but to open it up for dialogue, to say, all right, so here's the work that's been done, right? What are we missing? Or like we are inviting you to give us constructive feedback. And like that's just got to be baked into the culture. I mean, if you don't bake that into the culture, it's never going to happen. And people don't know it's okay. And I even think if you want to go as far as like reach out to a couple board members before a board meeting and say, can you really, like, we're going to pose this question and we really are trying to like get the board more engaged with discussion and like not just vote and move on and rubber stamp this, but like we actually really want your feedback. So can you jump in when the board chair like opens this up for discussion before we take a vote? So I really think it's that. I mean, I do think leadership's probably top and foremost, the leadership and culture of the organization, and it starts with the board chair. But sometimes the board chair doesn't know differently or doesn't realize that maybe that's happening, which is why I think an executive director can say, hey, like, think that we're seeing some of this, or like, I think we're seeing a lot of rubber stamping and I really want to try to move us away from that. Can we come up with a plan for how we start to do that? Because it's got to come from modeling and inviting questions. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents.
I think from a nonprofit staff perspective, there really is a fine line between a board that's disengaged and not paying attention and not asking questions, and a board that's in the weeds, questioning everything and making board meetings hell on earth for staff, right?
Right.
So there's this, it feels like there's a sweet spot right in the middle of like not being annoying, but also like helping to get the organization moving in the right direction by asking good questions. So I think there are a few different ways that I think that I would recommend to tackle it. So specifically on the finance side, and this is something that, like, seriously, if I was going to write a book, this is what I would write a book about. I'm not going to write a book. Don't worry. It would be deeply boring. I think the topic would be like, when you go into from the finance perspective, when you present a typical set of financial statements to a board, like, they have no relevance to the to a nonprofit organization at all. Like, so what the balance sheet is supposed to tell you, the balance sheet is supposed to tell you whether your organization is solvent, which is nonsensical for an organization. The income statement is there to tell you whether the organization is profitable, which is nonsensical for a nonprofit organization. And the cash flow statement is totally unintelligible. It's broken into 3 sections: an operating section, a finance section, and an investment section. 2 of those sections are totally irrelevant to nonprofits, so it's really only the operating section. So like, of all of the junk that you just dumped on them as part of a financial statement, that you have to do, you're not required, you're required to do it. You can't just like they suck, I'm not going to do it. You have to do it. But you give it to them and they're like, none of this matters. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And so from a CFO perspective, like, I don't want you asking any questions about this, because it's guaranteed that question is going to be totally irrelevant. It's not going to have anything to do with the work of our organization, right? So you don't want them digging into the details in the board meeting and making things worse. So what you do is you end up pulling it out to the committee. So one of the ways that I would tackle this with the specific intent of not making the board meeting suck is to pull any of this conversation out to a committee where you can have more time to talk about one specific topic and ask questions of the board members that are in that committee and pose them as like dilemmas, or pose them as like, here's something we've been working on internally and we can't quite figure out like what direction we want to go, and we'd love your advice, right? And you don't want to do that in a board meeting because now the board meeting is 4 hours long and you're in the weeds, right? But in a committee, like if you have less specific rubber stamp work, then you can use the committee to have these deeper conversations that might be helpful, and then bring those recommendations up to the board, which then can rubber stamp them in the board meeting, right? So I think the committee would be one thing. The other thing I would do is we forget as nonprofit professionals, we forget that boards pay attention to us about 1% of their life. Like we know they're committed. We know they're good board members. We don't want to discount their service. But as a board member, like you think about it when you get the materials for the board meeting. You don't think about it on the drive to the board meeting or while you're logging into the board meeting on Zoom or whatever. And you think about them while you're in the board meeting. So you may have 1 hour a quarter that you're really focused on this organization, which doesn't give you a lot of, like, you can't do anything 1 hour a quarter and be good at it. It's just not possible. You have to think about it more frequently than that. And so the board meetings, the board members a lot of times are just sort of stunned. You've dumped information on them. They've got these nonsensical financial statements that don't have any relevance to anything. You're giving them board reports and you're guaranteed you're using acronyms that they've totally forgotten what the acronym means, right? So they're in the board meeting and they're just like, I don't get it. Like, but I'll say I. So I'm going to rubber stamp stuff because I trust you as a nonprofit staff member that you've done your job and that you're giving me true information, right? So I think like recognizing that the board members aren't giving you full attention and like trying to put yourself in their position to say, like, what do they really want to know about us? If you were a board member and you recognized you're walking into this situation? And that's why I'm saying, like, if as a nonprofit professional, if you can get on another nonprofit's board, like you will learn so much about like what it's like to truly be a board member. It's hard. A lot of nonprofits don't want other nonprofit people on their board, but being in that position of like kind of not really understanding what's going on, like gives you a lot more information about how to communicate with your own board. So the things they're worried about are like, they're sitting there thinking like, okay, I don't understand any of these words. These acronyms are new to me. I think I've seen this one before, but I'm not really sure. You're just asking me if we want to do this. I don't know what questions to ask because I don't know enough about this project because literally I've been thinking about it for 14 seconds. So now what am I going to, so, okay, we'll just say I to this and move on because I don't really have enough information. And like, so if you put yourself in the board member's position, like maybe you need to have better ways to communicate with them that you need that information, that like you want to have more of a conversation with them and recognize that they're really busy and they may just tell you to forget it. You're like, I don't have time for you. My bank gives you a check. I show up because I'm required to. Then like, who cares that they're going to rubber stamp something? That's the best case scenario for that board member. But give the other board members that are more engaged opportunities to engage in a meaningful way in some other way. I think that's probably how I'd try to tackle it.
I love those ideas. I was just like, oh my gosh, I want it. Yes to the committees. But I also was thinking one of the things I've seen work well is sometimes before a committee goes to work, like having a brief, doesn't have to be long, but discussion at the meeting, which again, like helps set this up for the committee. Like, hey, we're going to get like the committee, we're going to have this committee work on, whatever, board recruitment process, a new board recruitment process. We're going to get, open this up right now for some discussion or like what's working. What do you think we need to be looking at? What's different? So you get some overall feedback from the board, but it's limited. So you're not having a 4-hour board meeting. Then it goes to committee and the committee has something to work with too, instead of like a blank slate. And then by the time it gets back, the board feels like they've had a voice. The committee's listened to it theoretically and added their fine touches. And then, a rubber, just approving is fine. I also think the pre-read piece is huge in this. And I realized it when you were talking, Andy, because I was like, one of the reasons we get rubber stamp is we send out, and there's that's a whole other like conversation reason why this happens. But we send out like, all the materials a day in advance or the morning of a board meeting, and people don't have time to actually dive in, really review. And I don't always think, nonprofit staff have been trained on how to like actually present info to a board to provide the background, the context. Here's what we did to get to this point. Like I'm always in some of the groups I work with, I always say, spend a little time reminding them of where you've been. Let's see, the last 6 months, we've looked at X, Y, and Z. Like, because to your point, Andy, they don't remember. Like, I wouldn't remember. Like, here's what we've been through over the last 6 months. Here's what we looked at. Here's the stuff we did. We took your feedback, and here's where we're coming to you. But I think putting some of that context in even writing for pre-read that you get to the board at least a week in advance so that they actually can fully participate in the conversation and be intelligent, because we're sort of setting them up for failure when we're like, yeah, here it is. Or how many times do you get the board materials the day of and you're like, yeah, read it. Oh, okay. Read these while we're in the board meeting. And it's like, yeah, you're not going to get good discussion from that.
Thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule to listen to us blabber about nonprofit stuff for a little while. Thanks again. We like the questions coming in. Please keep sending them. Little questions, big questions, easy questions, complicated questions. We'll take them all. There's also a whole bunch of information on nonprofiteverything.com, show notes for every single one of our shows. There's an episode index. There's you could type in like a keyword and it'll pop up all of the episodes where a question with that keyword was answered. There's a ton of resources on there. Also, we've got a Discord channel. You can get to that from the Nonprofit Everything website as well. Please rank us in the ratings wherever you found this podcast. There's probably a way to give it some stars. So go ahead and give it some stars. And please send us your feedback. People have been giving us feedback lately. We love it. We absolutely read all of it. And anything that we can do, we will absolutely do. If you've got comments on the way the show works, how often it comes out, what kinds of questions we answer, sound quality, music, anything you like, let us know and we will do our best to address it. So thanks for joining us again, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.